All right, good evening, everyone. Shavua Tov. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for coming out. And I hope to spend the next little bit of time exploring what I found to be a really thought-provoking subject, something that I think we'll be very familiar with, but there'll be novelty to the approach that hopefully will offer some insight. I want to start off in the following way. In 1928, check something. 1928, Yeshiva University was already a growing institution in some format, and the then president, Dr. Bernard Revel, became president in 1915, raised $3 million in pledges towards what he would hope would become Yeshiva College, which would be the first, more or less the first of its kind yeshiva that would be a degree granting institution. And we know in 1928 that was not a great time to raise $3 million in pledges. Why? 1929 happened. And so the idea of Yeshiva University, the idea of a yeshiva college that would offer degrees, offer a high level of academic and yeshiva education, found itself to be bankrupt. And this was true really through the 70s, for much of its lifetime, for 50 years or so, in various formats, in various ways. The yeshiva was always struggling with its income. I start off talking about this original failed campaign of Yeshiva University because that is a little bit the question I want to explore tonight. Right? The bankruptcy of modern Orthodoxy. What are we challenged? How are we challenged? And how should we think about the future? This institution, under the leadership of Dr. Revel, did giving out degrees over the next 5 to 10 years. Eventually, it became not only an undergraduate program, it became a law program. And in the 1940s, under new leadership, under the leadership of Dr. Samuel Belkin, we know that Yeshiva University brings over a family, hires a family that would transform, that would revolutionize what we would come to know as modern Orthodoxy, would revolutionize really the entirety of the American Orthodox experience. Yeshiva University hires the Soloveitchik family. First, the father, Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, who you probably know less about, then the son, Yosef Dov, who we essentially can't go weeks without mentioning. So the Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, he becomes a Rosh Yeshiva at YU. He's not based in New York. And this is an important component to the history, to understanding what was his message, understanding his influence. Where did the Rav live? He lived in Boston. Why is that significant? People had to drive him to the airport whenever he wanted to travel. He was always traveling Monday through Thursday, and then he would be back in Boston. It's significant for another reason. What's Boston famous for? A lot of things. Most significantly, higher institutions of learning. This would have a massive impact on the Rav. Being part of the Boston educational aristocracy would shape his thinking profoundly. So the Rav is living in Boston, and he splits his time between Boston and New York. It's no coincidence that he's there. It's a capital for the most brilliant minds that America has to offer, and he indeed follows this model. He encourages Yeshiva University to incorporate the model of lichatchila, on purpose, deliberately teaching students to the highest degree possible, both Torah and general studies, for it to be both a yeshiva and a university. At the same time, there is another rabbi, pioneer, who is critical, who's instrumental in both saving American Jewry, creating an institution that has shaped American Jewry as much, if not a lot more, than Yeshiva University. And he was instrumental throughout the war in saving Jews from the Shoah. And of course, talking about Rav Aaron Kotler. Rav Aaron Kotler founds also in the late 1940s a small little yeshiva called Beis Medrash Gavoa. Where is that yeshiva? Lakewood. Why does he choose Lakewood? Does anyone know? He chooses Lakewood for exactly the opposite reason that the Rav chooses Boston. Lakewood is nothing. There is nothing there. The guys in the yeshiva will have nowhere to go, will have no distractions. I know when I was in YU, the pull of going down to Manhattan was massive. In Lakewood, not true today, but true in the 1940s and 1950s, there is nothing there. And Rav Kotler deliberately chooses a desert to start his yeshiva, a desert to establish a Makom Torah, so the students can do what? They can focus exclusively on Torah study. There's no intellectual elite, there's no conversations to be had about the world and about the environment and about philosophy. This was exclusively to be a Makom Torah. And we have these two institutions flourishing over the next 50 years, next 70 years, going in completely different directions. And to be honest, if we're going to stand here today, one has to say that Lakewood has far outperformed Yeshiva University. Yes, Yeshiva University has graduated thousands of undergraduates. Yes, Yeshiva University has graduated thousands of rabbis, and these rabbis are across the country. But Lakewood is in the tens of thousands. Lakewood's impact we've seen massively over the last 10 years. I believe we're going to see it continue to encroach, continue to creep into our world even further. And we have to talk about what it means. We have to talk about what it means for us to be engaging, for us to be connecting to a yeshiva who by design was exclusively focused on Torah study. Now we are 70 years later. 70 years after the founding of Lakewood Yeshiva, 70 years after the founding after Rav Soloveitchik started his time as Rosh Yeshiva at YU. The question is, where are we today? Look at page number 2. I've included on the top of the page the PJC mission. I want to return to that, I think, at the end of our discussion tonight. In April 2021, Rabbi Efrem Goldberg, who is probably at this point the most prominent modern Orthodox rabbi, I say that with a asterisk next to it because of what we're about to read, one of the most prominent YU rabbanim in the country. He has a family of probably 1,000 to 1,200. He has a shul of 1,000 to 1,200 families, hundreds of children in the most beautiful corner that has only exploded over the last 2 years. It was exploding already, but many have looked to Boca Raton and to Rabbi Goldberg for their rabbinic leadership. In April 2021, he famously wrote the following, titled, "I am not a modern Orthodox rabbi. Data and anecdotal evidence show that there are many in the yeshivish communities regularly listening to the shiurim of YU Rabbanim, and there are a growing number of modern Orthodox young people finding meaning in the Hasidic Sfarim and contemporary leaders like Rav Itcha, Meir Morgenstern, Rav Gamliel Rabinowitz, Rav Elimelech Biederman, and others." The rabbis they mentioned are all Hasidic, very Haredi Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael, some of which I've had the opportunity to listen to and to learn. There are Jewish magazines that may be perceived as right-wing, but have, have large readership in the modern Orthodox communities. These magazines are not locked into one hashkafa, but they feature many exposing their readership to great leaders across the spectrum of the Torah community. The diversity of their growing subscription base testifies to the spectrum of the Torah community. The diversity of their growing subscription base testifies to the thirst and appetite to walk through the Shar HaKolel, not just through one particular gate. He's talking about being a Klal Yisrael Jew. The Shar HaKolel is the gate for every Jew. I had a Rebbe who would say, "You can put me in a box when I'm dead. Until then, don't try to fit me into one of your labels." Perhaps others feel more comfortable in their position if they can either count you among their tribe or decide that you are part of the tribe that they have rejected. But while narrow vision serves them, and again, to be perfectly clear, I'm not casting negative aspersions on any people who choose this path, it doesn't have to be our way. A student, Rav Hutner, once confided that he felt secular career meant he was living a double life. Rav Hutner responded, that someone who switches between the room they rent in a hotel and the room they rent in a house is leading a double life. However, someone who rents a house that has so many rooms is leading one life. We don't have to cram into one room. We can spread out across the house called Torah. It has many rooms. They are decorated and function differently. They complement one another. Rabbi Goldberg is trying to make the point that he doesn't believe in labels, doesn't believe there's a beneficiary to labels. Not only that, right, with the lowering of the barriers to material, to content, to dynamic personalities, with great accessibility, the people themselves anyway are not interested in definitions, they're not interested in labels, they're going to whom they find inspiration. What's your reaction? Makes sense. Let's continue. I got a lot of shrugs. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, the great Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Zion, said the following. He wrote in 2014 a magnificent essay called A Spiritual Accounting of Centrist Orthodox. He writes the following. The key issue distinguishing our approach from that of our colleagues on the right is the question of whether to adopt an attitude of everything is in the Torah or to append, balance, and round out. Balance, and round out. With respect to this issue, I think we stand on solid ground. We have a position which need not be viewed as being the sole position, nor even be regarded historically as the majority position, but surely it is a sound and solid and legitimate position. I believe, therefore, that the problem confronting centrist orthodoxy today is not, or ought not to be, primarily ideological. Rav Lichtenstein, keep in mind, was the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Har Zion. He had a PhD in late medieval English literature. Do you know where from? Harvard University. And he was the son-in-law of Rav Soloveitchik. Keep that in mind as well. He continues. Be this as it may, I believe, so he's introducing his article, he's introducing his essay essentially by saying, I think we're in a good place. The idea of finding wisdom in secular studies is a valuable idea. I think we can easily make the case for that. Be that as it may, I believe that the light by which we walk is a reliable guide. Not the sole guide, but a thoroughly legitimate one. Our question then is, how well and how faithfully do we as a community walk by it? Our problem is not on the conceptual level, but rather on that of implementation, both operational and experiential. We will turn next to this question, the second component of our cheshbon nefesh. He continues later on in the essay, saying much more clearly what I think what he's really concerned about. It is precisely here, I'm afraid, that our cheshbon nefesh begins. How much of our centrism indeed derives from the dialectical tension, and how much from tepid indifference? Is our commitment to Talmud Torah truly as deep as that of the right, but only modified in practice by the need to pursue other values? Do our students devote as much time and effort to the Talmud Torah, minus only that needed to acquire the culture or build a state? Comparisons aside, let us deal with specific educational issues. What has all the time wasted in television, the inordinate vacations, a system of religious public schools in Israel, which shuts down at 1 or 2 in the afternoon, to do with culture or Zionism, right? He's writing for an Israeli audience, but the question's really cut deep, right? We believe in a lifestyle. We believe in a methodology of living, which is we are very much part of the world. We very much benefit and contribute to the world. At what cost? How does that impact our Jewish life? That's how I wanted to start, how I wanted to set the table. I want to quote one other book. There was this beautiful book called Mentor of the Generations, Reflections on Rav Soloveitchik, edited by a Baltimore native, by Zev Elif, who is a Baltimore native. And there's an essay about the early life here written by Lander. Dr. Bernie Lander was the founder of Landers College, which ended up being one of the great rivalries between Yeshiva University and Landers. Landers was certainly a more right-wing institution. He writes the following. In 1970, I was present at the Chag HaSmicha. The Chag HaSmicha is the celebration of rabbinic graduates. So I was present at the Chag HaSmicha and the luncheon in which the Rav dramatically opposed Dr. Belkin's decision to modify the charter of Yeshiva College to non-sectarian, thus making the college eligible for government funds. REITs would remain a religious school affiliated with Yeshiva University. The Rav was concerned that sometime in the future, the yeshiva's change of status would ultimately compromise the yeshiva's mission and standards. Though he had confidence that Dr. Belkin would not permit this to happen, the Rav recalled the ancient syllogism, all men are mortal, Aristotle is a man, therefore Aristotle is mortal. This issue became a point of great tension between the Rav and Dr. Belkin. The Chagei HaSmicha of 1937 and 1970 bracketed the Rav's career at yeshiva and demonstrated a deep commitment to the pristine nature of the Torah environment of yeshiva. I do not mean, however, to say the Rav was obscurantist or opposed to secular knowledge. This was, of course, not the case. The Rav was a towering intellect. The breadth and the depth of his knowledge in all areas was astounding. He believed that we must encounter and engage the general society. Rav Soloveitchik was once asked, how is it possible for him to be a gadol b'Torah, for him to be as brilliant and as knowledgeable as he was in the Torah studies, and also to know philosophy, to know English literature, to know science, and to know math. All other gadolei Torah were spending their time exclusively focused on Torah studies. How did he maintain his commitment, his intensity towards Torah studies, and also know all the other stuff? Rav Soloveitchik was probably feeling a little bit sharp in his response, and he said, while all of the other Gedolei Torah are busy criticizing me, I'm busy reading philosophy. I have a lot of time for philosophy. Okay, but we have the privilege of hindsight. Right? We're living in 2021. We're living through extraordinary times. And the question is, where are we? Where have we come? Where are we going? So let's look further. Skip the next source. Look at Rabbi Saul Berman, The Ideology of Modern Orthodoxy, the Shamar Journal, written in 2001. Two separate experiments are currently in progress in the Orthodox community. The Haredi experiment starts with the assumption that the two worlds are so radically opposed that the only way to safeguard the Orthodox worldview is to maximize separateness. This required the development of a vision in which the ideal life is led entirely within the confines of the Orthodox community. Men in kollel, women at home, children in schools that reflect the desired uniformity of religious behavior. When economic conditions require adult departure from safe ground, the deviant experience should be minimized in time and degree of intersection with the external world and should not be granted any value for itself. The modern Orthodox experiment begins with the assumption that Orthodoxy can preserve its integrity and passion and even be enriched by its intersection with modernity, and that the interaction will allow Orthodoxy to bring to the broader world a clearer vision of the grandeur of Torah. On the other hand, this approach does not deny that there are areas of powerful inconsistency and conflict between Torah and modern culture that need to be filtered out in order to preserve the integrity of halakha. Right? The easier route, the easier approach is to shut everyone out. The easier approach is to build our own institutions, to focus on in a very insular way, and to do our best to minimize our interaction with the secular world. Just to give you an insight into who Rabbi Berman was. Rabbi Saul Berman, born in 1939, is an American scholar and modern Orthodox rabbi. He was ordained by Yeshiva University. He also received a BA and his MHL, and he completed a degree in law, a JD from NYU. He has an MA in political science from University of California, Berkeley. In 1997, he became the director of EIDA, a new organization devoted to at the time it was a new organization devoted to integration of modern Orthodox ideology and religious life. Due to financial constraints, EIDA was absorbed into Yeshiva Chovevei Torah, at which point Berman took an administrative position. He now serves as the associate professor at Yeshiva University and teaches at Columbia University Law School. So he presents in the clearest terms the conflict that we need to think about, which is if you want to live a spiritual, committed Orthodox life, how do you balance that? One approach is cut everything else. Cut everything out. Another approach is what I hope to articulate now. We're going to explore a topic. We're going to explore a topic over the next few minutes that the surface level of the topic will resonate. And as we go deeper, I think it's incredibly eye-opening. Look at source number 1. This comes from the Shulchan Aruch on the laws of Yom Kippur. Haggah. Yesh gasvu shenagu lilbosh begadim leveinim nikiyim b'Yom Kippurim. What's the minhag? What's the custom? To wear white. Right? The custom is Yom Kippur. Dugmas malachei asharis. Why do we do it? So we can be like the heavenly angels. V'chei nogim lilvosh hakitol shu lavan v'naki. Why? How do we do this? Gentlemen wear a kittel. Gamhu beged mesim v'al yedei zeh leiv ha'adam nivneh v'nishbar. Right? When you're wearing the clothes that you're going to be buried in, the assumption is you're going to be broken. The assumption is it's going to break you. It's going to put you in a place where you are humble and ready for the holiest of days. Are there any other reasons why? Look at Rav Kiva Eger. Rav Kiva Eger, one of the great rabbinic leaders of the 18th century, writes as the following. Like the Shulchan Aruch, there is written a custom to wear white clothes. There's also a custom to avoid wearing gold, any gold, golden jewelry, golden watches, anything that's gold. Anyone here have the custom to avoid wearing gold? Right? Legitimate custom. The Rosens do it. It's a legitimate custom. We know that. Okay? Why? Why don't you wear gold in Yom Kippur? What? Beautiful. It will remind Hashem of the Egel. The Egel was a particularly dark moment in our history, and the last thing we want to do on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, is to remind God of that terrible moment. What's the Hebrew phrase for that? Ein kategar nases hanegar. What does ein, besides for rhyming beautifully, what does ein kategar nases hanegar mean? It means you shouldn't make the prosecution into your defense. How do we begin Yom Kippur? How do we begin Yom Kippur? You should know. Kol Nidre. We begin Yom Kippur with Kol Nidre. What is Kol Nidre? Kevin's going to stand at that bima one night this week, Wednesday night. 2 people are going to stand on either side. And what are we setting up? We're insisting that we should start Yom Kippur with a beis din. We insist that what we're doing over Yom Kippur is a court case. Why do we insist that it should be a court case? Because there's many ways court cases can be dismissed. It's not always that you're actually innocent of the accused crime. There are procedural issues. There are issues of evidence. There are other issues that can come up that could favor us as the defense. If you're standing in front of the judge, what's the last thing you want to do? And you're accused of murder. What's the last thing you want to bring to the judge's attention? The knife. Standing in front of the judge, you're holding the knife. That's not a smart defense. And so Rabbi Kiva Eger introduces to Katega Nases and Eger. It's actually a source from the Talmud that we'll look at in a second. We don't wear gold on Yom Kippur because we don't want to wave the knife in the face of the judge. Uvenashim lo shayach. Why? Women should not have this custom. They can wear all the gold they want. Why? They weren't involved in the ego. And not only that, the holonos nuzav le'egel, uven levim, and also the Levites. So, do women have this custom? Yes. Terry says women have this custom. Rabbi Kiva Eger's conclusion here is very problematic because we know that the Kohen Gadol, and we're going to talk about this in a few minutes. The Kohen Gadol, what does he do? Anytime he goes inside the Kodesh Kodashim, what does he do? He wears only white. He takes off all gold. He changes from 8 articles of clothing to 4 articles of clothing. Why? Ein kategar nasis hanegar. The Kohen Gadol is going to walk in front of the dying. He's going to walk in front of the ultimate judge, and he's going to be carrying the murder weapon? No. He takes it all off. By the logic, should he have to? Who is he? He's a Levi. He's a Kohen. So there's a massive tension here. Is he acting as a representative of Klal Yisrael? Is he not? We'll get to it. Wonderful. So Rabbi Akiva Eger introduces this idea, Ein Katega Nasis Anega. Where does it apply? How does it apply? You can't just say, anytime you exist, do we have gold in our shul? Do we avoid putting gold in our shul? What are the limitations? What are the criteria for this halacha, for this custom? Let's look at it. It's first introduced in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. Kol ha-shofros ksherim chutz mishal para. All shofros are kosher for use except for what? The cows. Why can't we use the cow's shofar? Hold on. What?
It's a Karen.
It's a Karen. It's called a Karen. It's not called a shofar. The name for the the cow's horn is a Karen. Mipnei shu Karen. Amar Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef comes along and says, "V'lo kol shofros nikru Karen." All shofars are called Karen. Shene'emar b'memshach Karen hayovel. Okay. So let's skip ahead to the Gemara. Ula Amar. Ula says the following. Hainetana to Rabbanan. This is the reasoning of the Rabbanan, the Rav Chisda. It's like the opinion of Rav Chisda. The Amar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, why can't you use the cow's horn? Well, this is what Rav Chisda says. Mipnei ma ein kohen gadol nichnas b'bitei zav lefnei lefnim la'avod avoda. Why can't the kohen gadol wear his golden garments all the way inside? Lefnei lefnim. That's a phrase that we need to become familiar with. Lefnai lefnim means all the way inside in the Kodesh Kodashim. Lefnai means before, and lefnim means inside. Lefnai was before God, lefnim in the most holy of places. So why can't he wear his big day zahav lefnai lefnim? Lefish ein katega nasis anega. This is the first time in Shas we've interacted with this principle. The prosecution should not be your defense attorney. V'lo, v'ha eva dam par. Is that true? Doesn't he bring with him the blood of the cow? He sprinkles the blood of the cow inside the Kodesh Kodashim. The cow is what we worship. What do we do with that? Ho v'ishtani ishtani. So we have principle number one. If the form of it has changed, if you've melted down the dagger and made it into something else, it's no longer a dagger, and you can bring it in front of the judge. V'ha'ika aron u'kaporas u'kruv. What's the issue? Is there gold inside Lefnai Lefnim? Is there gold inside the Kodesh Kodashim? There is. The aron is made out of gold. The kruvim are made out of gold. There's a lot of gold there. What do we do with that? Chote bal Yaakov ka'amrina. It's not that gold can't exist in the Kodesh Kodashim Lefnai Lefnim. It should just be brought by the defense. Don't bring gold in. It can exist in the Kodesh Kodashim, but don't bring it in. But the Kohen is carrying a spoon and a tray that's made out of gold. The sinner shouldn't have, right? He's allowed to use them as tools, but he shouldn't have them as part of his existence, part of his being. He shouldn't adorn them. They shouldn't be there to beautify them. Right? What's the final qualification? He wears the gold garments when he's doing the avoda outside, meaning the Kohen Gadol could wake up on Yom Kippur and just put on the white garments and wear them all day. But that's not what he does. He's constantly switching back and forth between the white garments and the gold garments. And it's very uncomfortable because every time he switches, he has to go to the mikveh. So to make it more efficient, to make it more simple, you should wear the white garments the whole day, especially if there's a situation of Ein Katega Nasis Anega. Why is he wearing gold itself on the day of Yom Kippur? What's the answer? The answer is it only applies with Lefnai Lefnim. It only applies when you're standing before the judge. When the Kohen Gadol is in the Heichal, when he's in the section that's outside the Kodesh Kodashim, when he's performing the avoda, bringing the karbanos in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, doesn't matter. He's not standing in front of the judge. When he's Lefnai Lefnim, when he's inside the Kodesh Kodashim, it's a chutzpah to bring the murder weapon. And so he doesn't. He's not permitted. Turn the page over. So the qualifying criteria of ein kateger is the following. It needs to be in its original format. The sinner must be the one seeking atonement. A sinner should not wear the item, shouldn't adorn them, and only one that comes inside, lifnai v'lifnim, qualifies. Rashi adds to this as follows. Well, let's pause for a second. What was the Talmud? What was the Talmud, the original Talmud piece say? The shofar shouldn't be from what? From a cow. Shofar shouldn't be from a cow. Remember, the original suggestion is should be from a cow, but it's not a shofar, it's a keren. But all shofars are called keren, so why don't we have a shofar from a cow? Ein kategar nasa sanegar, the prosecution should become the defense. So look at our criteria. Does the shofar meet the criteria? It's not bifnim. It's not lifnai v'lifnim. Where do we blow the shofar? In the Beis Hamikdash, we blow it in the courtyard. Where do we blow the shofar? So can we use a par? Can we use a cow's horn? Even today? No, the minhag is not to. Not only that, the minhag is even further. The Rosens don't come to shul on Yom Kippur. Sorry, guys. They don't come to shul on Yom Kippur wearing any gold. Does that fit all the criteria for ein kateger nasa sanegar? What does Rashi do? Rashi says the following. What does Rashi look at the Chidushei Ritva. Chidushei Ritva says the following. She'ein kateger shelo lahazkir maser ego b'derech she'ein kohen gadol nichnas b'bigdei zav lifnim. Right? This is establishing that the kohen gadol shouldn't wear gold inside. The shofar nami, shofar is also ein kateger. What's the goal of the shofar? To bring us closer to the Almighty. And even though it's outside, it's not lifnai v'lifnim, lo chashinim laha, daha mishamish b'bigdei zav al mizbech chitzon. Right? Yes, he wears the golden clothes on the mizbech that's outside. Even the inner mizbech. Hay shofar kiven zikaron asi lahachnis tfilason shall Yisrael lifnai v'lifnim k'lifnim dami. What's the purpose of the shofar? It's to bring our prayers before God. The purpose of the shofar is to bring our tefillot lifnai v'lifnim. And again, you can't use the murder weapon in front of the judge. If the purpose of the shofar is to carry out tefillot lifnai v'lifnim, ein kateger nasa sanegar certainly applies. What does he say at the end? V'talis mitzuyetzes shi muzheves mutal bosh b'yom kippurim da'avadek l'chutz dama. He adds one little permission to those who want to wear a talis with gold. You can wear a talis with gold in Yom Kippur because it's l'chutz dama. It's not lifnai v'lifnim. Moving on. Look at the Matei Ephraim. Nogam anashim l'bosh kitzel. Shu lavan v'naki v'gam l'fi shu beged meisim v'al yedei zeh leiv ha'adam nichna v'nishbar l'chein gama avel, etc., etc., etc. There's a custom to wear a kittel because it is the big day meisim. Yochel l'bosh ha'kittel b'yom kippur v'nogu be'eis ha'nesuin she'ozen ha'kittel l'chatan miyafin oto v'osin bo atara. When a chatan wears a kittel, what they used to do? They used to make this beautiful crown for the kittel. Shal kesef, out of what? Silver. Out of silver. Al beis hatzoa lafisha lovshin osel b'yom hakadosh. V'gam b'yom tov shal pesach b'shnei leilos. Right, we wear this beautiful kittel on Yom Tov as well, on Pesach. V'chein hayunogim milefnim la'asos habayis hatzoa. Mu'utar ba'atara shel kesef. Add the silver atara to this beautiful kittel. But there was this weird practice to consider started making those atarot out of zahav. O miktsasa kesa miktsasa zahav, or partially out of gold, partially out of silver. Leman haros tiferes kadusam, so they can express how great they are, how wealthy they are, how capable they are, how rich they are. Lo yadu sheyesh samach min hatalmud shelo luvosho zahav, shouldn't wear gold. L'chein roi lahachzir atara liyos nechefa bekesef. Right? You should not wear gold in your atara, in your crown. L'chein hanashim haloveshes leveinim b'yom kodesh hazeh ein matrin osam zahavin u'minhag Yisrael Torah. Also, women have the custom not to wear gold on Yom Kippur. Right? So, if you take a pause and you look at the men's talitot, and certain men have an atara, have a crown on top of their talitot, what's that usually made out of? Silver. Why? You never see a gold atara. You never see a gold atara. I believe it's because of this Matei Ephraim. We don't bring gold in front of the judge. Now we're going to take a little bit of a side note, just to drive home a point, and then we'll come back to modern Orthodoxy. The Sefer Hasidim has this incredible story. Listen to this story. There was a man, a chassid, a very righteous human being who used to pray wearing what? A chila. Does anyone know what a chila is? A special prayer robe. He had a prayer robe. It was specific for him. It was pure, it was clean, it was beautiful. So originally for a while he was praying and God would answer him and would give him a favorable response. After a while, God stopped answering him. Sefer Chasim, just parenthetically, was written by Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. There is some machlokas, same arguments amongst the academics, whether he wrote the whole thing, he wrote part of it. Rabbi Yehuda Chassid lived in the 12th century during a very mystical time. Very eccentric personality. I have a whole bio here on Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. See if I can tell you anything. His name was Judah ben Samuel of Regensburg. Born 1150, he died 1217. Legends describes Judah, Rav Yehuda Chassid, as an excellent bowman who at the age of 18 was ignorant of the daily prayers. When, however, enlightenment suddenly came upon him, he performed many miracles. He restored the fertility of a young married woman. The prophet Elijah is said to have partaken in his Seder meal and to have been seen by him in a synagogue. He miraculously prevented a Jewish child from being baptized and knew the exact year of Israel's redemption. He maintained communications with the Bishop of Salzburg and acted as a seer for the Duke of Regensburg. This is a very, very eccentric and wonderful character. There's a lot more to say about him. So remember, there's this gentleman in his community who has this beautiful coat, purity, is praying beautifully. He gets answered, he gets answered from God, and then all of a sudden, after a while, God stops answering him. He tries again, and he doesn't get an answer. He asks the Chacham, what am I supposed to do? God was answering me, now God isn't answering me. What am I supposed to do? He says to him, Mitpalel mitchanein ata, the Sefer Sharosha Kasvo. What does he say? You're using a siddur that was written by a bad guy. You're using a siddur that was written by a bad guy. Amalei, ani nasati l'chtov l'poni hasofer. I gave it to this particular sofer. The sacharti oto. I hired him l'chtov al klaf shali yafeh. Right, this beautiful siddur for me. Right, I couldn't imagine that this sofer was such a bad guy. Was a Rasha. I hired him to write a special siddur. His heart was filled with impurity and disgustingness. Right? This sofer that you thought was so holy was actually profoundly impure. And why aren't you allowed to use this siddur? Ve'ein katega na'ases hanegar. Lakach ein roil sheyishma lecha ba'od she'ata mitzpalel bo. What does he say? God is not going to listen to your prayers. Why? What? Because the Siddur was written by a Rasha. Ein katega na'ases hanegar. Someone explain that. What does that mean? Think about it. The Siddur becomes the murder weapon? What are the criteria for Ein Katega Na'ases Hanegar? It has to be Lifnai Lifnim. What does that mean about our Siddurim? They're like, how are they like the shofar? Lifnim dummy. That's a beautiful chiddush. Listen to the chiddush. This is a stunning point. Something that we never think about. If the shofar carries our tefillot to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then the shofar is Lifnai Lifnim. And you can't use a shofar that reminds God of the Egal Zav. You don't want to be the guy who brings the murder weapon to the judge. The same has to be true about our Siddurim. Kalifnim dam. When you use a siddur, it's kalifnai v'lifnim. It's as if you're standing in front of God. Now, think about this for 1 second. The siddur is a massive innovation. In the 12th century, how did he get a siddur? He went to Shabsis. No, he didn't go to Shabsis. Although Shabsis may have existed in the 12th century. How did he get a siddur? He hired a scribe. When was the first siddur compiled? Anyone know? In the 900s, by Rav Sadia Gaon, created the first siddur. And so what happens between 900 and 1200? What happens to that siddur? Not only is it accepted, not only is this innovation integrated massively into Jewish life, it's seen that if this siddur is written by someone who has evil intentions, if this siddur is written by a Rasha, Ein Katega Na'ases Hanegar, not only is this siddur massively critical, but this siddur is what's there to bring you Lifnai Lifnim, just like the shofar. When do we blow the shofar? Not a trick question. When do we blow the shofar? Rosh Hashanah. When on Rosh Hashanah? Musaf and Rosh Hashanah. Name me something else that we do in the middle of davening. Name me another mitzvah that we do in the middle of davening. Bikos Kohanim to the side. What? Lulav and Esrog. Do you know what the other sugya in Shas is of Ein Katega Na'ases Hanegar? What? So, famous sugya, Lulav HaGazel. If you use a stolen lulav, what does the Talmud Bavli say? You're not allowed to do that because it's mitzvah haba ba'avera. By the way, Ein Katega Na'ases Hanegar, mitzvah ba'avera are two sides of one coin. What does the Yerushalmi say? The Jerusalem Talmud says the reason you can't use the lulav of a stolen lulav is Ein Katega Na'ases Hanegar. Why? Because these tools are integrated into tefillah. We blow shofar in the middle of Musaf because it brings our tefillos Lifnai Lifnim. We shake a lulav and esrog in the middle of Hallel because it brings our tefillos Lifnai Lifnim. And if we're using these tools to bring us to Lifnai Lifnim, Ein Katega Na'ases Hanegar. But that's not the only innovation of this. There's an extra innovation. Turn the page over. This debate, this discussion is 800, 900 years old. 900 years ago, some gentleman went up to Rav Yehuda Chassid and said, my prayers are not answered, what am I supposed to do? And the Chacham responds, you're supposed to get a new siddur. Does this theme carry through? Is this a halachically legitimate idea? Remember, Rav Yehuda Chassid is doing miracles, and he's like, is this a halachic principle? Look at source number 9. Yesh mi shekosach the shliach tzibur yisvalo mitoch sefer miyuchad the tzibur devadai nichtav lishmo. This is not some wackadoo out there sefer chasidim. What source is this? This is the Shulchan Aruch. This is the book that we use to define every single thing we do every single day. What does he say? The shliach tzibur has to do what? He has to use a special siddur. What do we have on our bima? We have an extra large siddur for the shliach tzibur. Why do we have an extra large siddur for the shliach tzibur? Because shliach tzibur can't see. He needs bigger print. Sometimes, especially when you think about the pronunciation you hear, sometimes he needs bigger print. You know why we have a special siddur for the shliach tzibur? Because of this halacha. His siddur needs to be written lishma. It needs to be written with the correct intention. What happens if his siddur is not written with the correct intention? Then his siddur, his tefillos are not accepted by God. Ein katega nasas anega. It's wild. Look at the Mishnah Brura. Mishnah Brura written in the end of the 19th century. Nichtav lishmo, perish nichtav l'shem shemayim. The siddur has to be written for the sake of heaven. V'lo l'shem hatiferes, not yudi v'afilo im siddur shal yachid. Hu b'chtav noeh yotem me'atzibur. V'svar medvasim ein chiluk bein shal tzibur liyach. He says this has to be true of the shliach tzibur siddur and has to be true of the individual siddur. Look at Sefer Maharil. Maharil generally writes about halachas. He writes about minhag. He writes the following: when he was honored with leading tefillah, the Mahavi Segal says, and they presented him with beautiful machzorim to pray from, he did not want to lead the community from anything but the siddurim and the machzor that were designated for the community, even if they were old, blackened, and imperfect. He said this was the instruction of the Rokeach, not to lead services from anything except the community books, because presumably they are written with proper intent, and perhaps with the rest described to not have the mitzvah intent, rather personal glory, God forbid, prayer for them might not be accepted. This is an unbelievable application of Ein Ketega Nasas Anega. Question is, how does it apply to today? What's the issue with today? It's for what? All from are printed. Is there an issue of Ein Ketega Nasas Anega? We still have a large siddur sitting on our bima right over there. Is there an issue of Ein Ketega Nasas Anega? So there are two. I'll take the issue even to a further level, right? To a crisis level for all of us. You want to hear the crisis? The early Jewish printing company that printed the Siddur Shiloh. You know the Shiloh Siddur? Everyone knows the Shiloh Siddur. How do you know the Shiloh Siddur? It was your first Siddur. That's what you learn all the base from. It was printed by a completely secular company. Completely secular. The owners of the company were secular. The printing press wasn't even Jewish. You're going to tell me all of those children's tefillos? Ein Ketega Nasas Anega. And you know what, Ramosha Feinstein? He's on the Lower East Side. The printing company that printed all the Shiloh Siddurim, do you know where it was located? On the Lower East Side. And so my Chavruta and I, we called the Dayan who lives there on the Lower East Side to say, Rav Moshe Feinstein, does he have a comment on this? He said, Rav Moshe Feinstein does have a comment on this, but not directly. Look at the comment of Rav Moshe Feinstein. One should not say that the primary mode of prayer is verbal, and our written prayers are merely reminders and prevent mistakes. Therefore, we should not be particular. After all, this is not a portion of the mitzvah itself. It is just a vehicle to fulfill the mitzvah properly. We see in the Ramah that the Chazan should use a special siddur. We see even a kosher siddur written from grandeur detracts partially from the acceptance of the prayer. For the Chazan, we are particular for this small flaw, since Hashem is never disgusted by the prayer of the community. But for the individual whose prayers are not guaranteed, a great flaw such as a violation of Shabbat and Yom Kippur results in a great prosecution, and it is forbidden for the individual to pray from them. Feinstein says you can't pray from a siddur that is printed by a secular printing company. Parenthetically, while we're in the space of printing companies, who's the most famous Jew to have ever lived? What? Philip Birnbaum. Why? Because we've all used Philip Birnbaum Machzorim. One of the greatest lines ever in the Birnbaum obit in the New York Times. Dr. Philip Birnbaum, a Jewish scholar and author whose translation of the synagogue liturgy has sold 300,000 copies since it was first published in 1949, died Saturday at his Manhattan home. He was 83 years old. The series of prayer books that bears Dr. Birnbaum's name for Sabbath holidays and daily devotions has outsold every other English translation, according to his publisher, the Hebrew Publishing Company. One writer called him the most obscure best-selling author. I love that line. The most obscure best-selling author. Trades as an educator and scholar, Dr. Birnbaum turned his talent to his knowledge, explaining simple prose, complicated concepts of law, tradition, etc., etc., etc. The Hebrew Publishing Company was not run by observant people. A lot of Jews used the Birnbaum Siddur. A lot of Jews. Turn the page over. The hour is late, so I'm going to skip the next piece. The next piece is written by Rav Moshe Sternbach, who's the Gaon of Beis Din in Yerushalayim, a very wonderful, eccentric, interesting, out there personality. He was a Rav in South Africa. South Africa did not have the resources that American Jewry had, and they were desperate for Siddurim. The question was whether they were allowed to take Siddurim from American non-Orthodox communities that no longer needed them. Rav Sternbach paskins that they shouldn't. Look at the last couple of lines. Dvarim nechonim be'ezras Hashem yisparach tov hadavar or noah b'siddur lekabel haskama. The siddur needs a haskama. It needs an approval. It needs a letter of approval. V'socha yershem hamatfisim shomrei Torah. Right? He paskins very explicitly that the siddur needs to be published by shomrei Torah. Shezeu sugula nifla she'tfilos yiskapel. It's very important for our tefillos to be accepted, that it's produced, that the siddur itself is produced in a kosher v'yosher way. What does this say about us? Think about it. Where did we start? We started with the Kohen Gadol not going into the Kodesh Kodashim wearing his gold clothes. Where are we now? How are we applying Ein Kategor? We start with one individual thousands of years ago. One day, one moment, going into one place. Where are we now? We're applying Ein Kategor not only, like the Talmud says, to the shofar, not only to the lulav, but to every tefillah that we offer. And what are the criteria for Ein Kategor Nasa Sanedor? Lifnai v'lifnin. That you have to be standing in front of the presence of God. In front of every shul in the world. Shavisi Hashem lenegli tamid, da lifnei mi ata omed. Know before whom you stand. The reason we can't use a siddur that's been printed with ill intentions is because it's the murder weapon. That's an unbelievable place for us to go. Not just that, what does that do to us? That transforms us into who? It used to be thousands of years ago that one man went to Lifnai Lifnim on one day, in one moment. What are we doing now 3 times a day? Every day of the year. Lifnai Lifnim. Now there's a challenge feeling that. There's a challenge knowing that. There's a reason we put Da Lifnei Mi'ata Omed on the tops of our shuls, in the fronts of our bimas. It's a massive challenge to know that we're going Lifnai Lifnim. But on that day, we are, in every day, 3 times a day, we are the Kohen Gadol. So what do we know about the Kohen Gadol? What do we know about his life? If we're living his life, what do we know about it? We're going to go 4 more minutes. So we've seen how our sanctuaries on Rosh Hashanah, when blowing the shofar, transformed Lifnai V'Lifnai. Right? We've seen how our lives are supposed to be transformed 3 times a day. The model for us is the high priest. We all become him each and every day, 3 times a day. We have a custom not to walk into shul on Yom Kippur wearing gold. That custom only began long after the temple was destroyed. The custom used to be for one man in one place. Now the custom is for all of us to refrain from wearing gold. This has shaped and impacted our synagogue so profoundly that you can't find a gentleman wearing a gold achara ever. You can't find a bima in any shul without a large, specially printed machzor for the chazan. Not because the chazan is blind, but because the chazan's tefillos are so important, are so critical, that he needs a special machzor written with the right intention. When Rabbi Land was the rabbi of the Jewish Center, he articulated a vision for modern Orthodox. That was a source that we skipped earlier. What was the vision that he articulated? In his words, modern Orthodoxy was a movement centered on our full commitment to Torah tradition and our openness at the same time to the wider culture of the world around us. We explore what that means. I think the Kohen Gadol becomes the perfect model for the lives we're supposed to live. The Kohen Gadol becomes a perfect model for what it means to be modern and to be Orthodox. Right? We're living in a world that is constantly challenging us to think about our values. Right? We have experienced ourselves. It's around the place of women in shul. We've experienced ourselves discussions around the impact of general society on how we observe, the impact of science in Jewish life, but the clash of Jewish identity and the many other identities that people can absorb today, especially when we think about people, how we should approach people who identify as LGBTQ+. These are massively important debates that we are uniquely positioned to engage with, to talk about, to think about, to empathize with. But from the seats, from the shoes of the Kohen Gadol, from the shoes of people who enter 3 times a day, lifnai v'lifnim. Right? It's so easy for us to be flippant about Orthodox life. General society has become incredibly flippant about Orthodox life. So much so that we are even trending on Netflix in our unorthodox life. Let's read source number 15. Dr. Erica Brown, why Orthodox living doesn't make good TV. At this point, reality TV this past year and a host of other programs and articles depict an orthodoxy that is narrow and limiting, as if it puts its adherents on notice. The complaints of one shallow, narcissistic, mercenary, and made-for-television individual sent Orthodox community spinning. The uncomfortable outside lens pushed many to think defensively about the beauty of our choices and forced us into articulating what moves and inspires us about our faith, commitments, and our lifestyle. At least it accomplished that. But the sudden outpouring that lit up social media also highlighted our most profound insecurities. Are there serious issues with today's centrist Orthodox, must contend? To be sure. Excessive materialism, parochialism, the lack of gender equity within a halachic framework are difficult, niggling problems, but they are our problems. If we are not bothering you, please leave us alone. We are not objects in your curiosity cabinet. To those who question their own orthodoxy as a result, perhaps it is time to put everyone else on the defensive instead. Even with its problems, centrist orthodoxy remains a compelling, wholesome, demanding, and aspirational response to modernity. Traditional communities practice their faith openly and strongly and are thus inspired to serve humanity and redress the world's great ills: poverty, injustice, loneliness, together. We should honor that and articulate it. We give 1/10 of our earnings to tzedakah charity. We take care of the sick, the widowed, the orphan. We welcome the stranger 1 day a week. Shabbat invites us to rest and disengage from a digital universe that has kidnapped the world as we know it. Our charmed, naive, Sabbath observant is unimaginable in most segments of society, but so desperately needed. We invest heavily in education and place our families first. We respect and treasure that which came before us and lovingly hand it down to the next generation. We believe and try to adhere to a high moral bar and make meaningful contributions in the fields of science, humanities, jurisprudence, government, and the arts. We believe that learning is a lifetime occupation. We achieve kedusha, holiness through tefillah, Talmud Torah. Zmirot and Chesed, the loving kindness that is the cement of our community. These features of orthodoxy may not make for good television, but they certainly make for good people. We live these values daily. We know what we are doing to make the world better. So should everyone else before putting another's community values under a microscope. I would only add not just that, but our willingness to listen, our willingness to empathize, our willingness to discuss the issues through the framework of ourselves as religious people, ourselves as modern people, and trying to constantly fuse those two, anchored in ancient traditions, anchored in an idea, anchored in a debate between Rabbi Yehuda Chassid and the man whose prayers weren't being answered 800 years ago. Enabling ourselves to continue that conversation and think about how do we present ourselves, how do we defend ourselves in the best light. Ein Katega Nas Senegar is magnificent, but not just that. Look at the source number 16. What happens at the end of the day in Yom Kippur? If we are to mimic the Kohen Gadol, what are we supposed to do at the end of the day? Look at the middle of the second line. He's finished everything. He's done all of the services. He's done all the sprinklings. He's done all the slaughterings. He's done all the bowings. He's done all he needs to do. All of the costume changes. He washes his hands and his feet. He takes off his golden clothes. He puts on his own personal clothes. This beautiful, beautiful man who put his life on the line, walked lifnai v'lifnim. He walked in front of God, the most dangerous act a human being can do, and he walks out. We know it's so dangerous because eventually so many Kohanei Gadolim were dying, they tied a rope around his waist so they could pull him out. So dangerous to walk in, and he was willing to do that on behalf of the Jewish people, to be with God, to be in the presence of God, to be impacted by it. How does he end his day? He's accompanied by the entire Jewish community back to his home. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rav Kook say that is part of his avoda. Going home is part of his avoda. Sitting with his family is part of his avoda. There was a halacha that the Kohen Gadol has to have a backup wife. What does that mean? There has to be a woman who's ready to quickly marry the Kohen Gadol because the Kohen Gadol has to have a family. Because he can't just stand lifnai v'lifnim. He has to stand in this world as well. He has to be informed in this world as well. Even when the Kohen Gadol is lifnai v'lifnim, he has a rope around his waist, being held by someone in the Kodesh, being held by someone in the real world. He feels the tug of the real world standing in front of God. He knows it exists. He has a family at home. And everyone accompanies him to his home. I'm going to skip the last source. You should read it yourself. It's a beautiful, beautiful source. Turn the page over. Before we conclude, I just want to say something explicitly and clearly. We have to engage in the challenges of modern times because we're uniquely positioned to do so. We're uniquely positioned to do so for two reasons. Like the Kohen Gadol, we have families. Like the Kohen Gadol, we are connected to the outside world. Like Gadol, we are educated and informed. We're representing all of the people. We understand what it means to be in the outside world. That's on one side. On the other side, we also understand what it means to be lifnai v'lifnim. It has to be that we engage in these debates and in these discussions from the fact that 3 times a day, every single day, we get to stand before God. And we have an intimate and close relationship with God. It can't be that we engage in these discussions just because we live in the modern world. And it can't be that we engage in these discussions just because we live in the Orthodox world. It has to be that we live in both. It has to be that we're going lifnai v'lifnim 3 times a day, every single day, in our shul, in this basic Knesset. We need to daven here every single day. Has to be that we have lifnai v'lifnim here as a constant presence in our lives. And it has to be that whatever happens here, we are tied to what's going on in the outside. We are connected to what's going on the outside. There's by way of conclusion, there is a massive, probably the most expensive siddur that's ever going to be sold, coming up on October 19th. Sotheby's is selling the Lutzato High Holidays Machzor. This is a 13th century Machzor. Beautiful. Go online, Google it. You'll look at this. This is a stunningly beautiful Machzor. This is the oldest Machzor that is still in print. You know how much it's going to sell for? They're predicting $4 million. Going to go at auction. It's going to sell for $4 million. What do you see in front of you? No, it's not a trick question. What do you see in front of you? There's a Jewish man. Yes, his sense of style is different than ours, but there's a Jewish man, and what's he saying? He's saying Amen. If you had to guess which page this picture was drawn on in the Machzor, which page would you put this man on? Yes, Phil. Ayom, 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 ayom. I'm saying no. Amen. Why do we scream Amen at the end of Musaf and Yom Kippur? Because not only are we standing lifnai v'lifnim on Yom Kippur in this space, standing before God, but we are committing Kel Melech Ne'eman. Amen are the Rashi Tevos for the words Kel Melech Ne'eman. God is our truthful King. We are committing to take the inspiration, the values, the connection that we have in this space. Take it with us. Amen. It's a commitment. We're taking it with us. We all scream Amen at the end. And what's so magnificent about that is 800 years ago, they were doing exactly the same thing. 800 years ago, they did enough to write it, to draw it in the siddur. This is the moment you scream Amen. This is the moment at the end of all the tefillos. At the end of standing in the presence of God for hours and hours and hours. You're screaming Amen because you know what? We get it. We live Orthodox lives. We live Lifnai v'Lifnim 3 times a day. We're in front of God. We're connected with God. We're embedded with God. And you know what? Like the Kohen Gadol, we're going to be particular. Ein katego nasa senega. We're going to be particular not to undermine ourselves, not to be insecure, not to think of ourselves as less than, or worse than, or less legitimate, or less authentic than. We're going to be committed to turning up fully authentically, fully engaged and fully committed to a God-centered life in this beautiful world that we live in. Should be a gemar chasima tova, should be a sweet, a healthy, a happy, and a spiritually inspiring new year. Thank you so much for sticking with me the whole way through. Shavua tov.